Chapter 1. The Crown in the Shadow. The blade gleamed under the May sun, a silver arc of death poised above Anne Boleyn's slender neck. On May 19, 1536, Tower Green held its breath as the mysterious swordsman from Calais, whispered to be the Shadow of Death, raised his weapon. The crowd roared, a carnival of cruelty, hurling jeers and stones at an effigy of the fallen queen. Then the sword fell. Her head rolled, blood spraying like a crimson veil, yet her eyes, wide, unyielding, seemed to stare defiantly into the abyss for a fleeting, horrifying moment, as if her soul cursed the world that betrayed her. Was this the end of Anne Boleyn, or the birth of a legend that would haunt England for centuries? 3 years earlier, Anne had swept through Westminster Abbey, her coronation a dazzling spectacle of power and ambition. Crowned Queen of England, she was a vision of wit, beauty, and defiance. A woman who dared to reshape a kingdom. Yet her brilliance ignited envy, her influence bred enemies. By 1536, the same fortress that once cradled her triumph became her prison, its stone walls echoing with the venom of false accusations. Adultery, incest, treason. Henry VIII, the king who once burned for her, now orchestrated her destruction, his heart already pledged to Jane Seymour. As Anne awaited her fate, whispers of her doom slithered through London streets, each delay a dagger twisting in her soul. This was no mere execution. It was a meticulously staged annihilation, designed to erase a queen from history itself. But could even a king's wrath silence a spirit so fierce? In June 1533, the air in Westminster Abbey shimmered with the weight of history. Anne Boleyn, 6 months pregnant, glided down the aisle, her crimson velvet gown trailing like a river of fire. The crown, heavy with jewels, rested on her dark hair, catching the light of 1,000 candles. Her almond-shaped eyes, sharp with intelligence, surveyed the crowd. Nobles who bowed, courtiers who whispered, and enemies who seethed in silence. She was no ordinary queen. Anne had defied the Catholic Church, toppled a queen, and bent a king to her will. Her marriage to Henry VIII had fractured England's ties with Rome, birthing a new era of religious upheaval. To her supporters, she was a beacon of reform. To her detractors, a sorceress who ensnared a king. As she knelt before the altar, the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the scepter in her hand, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Yet in the shadows of the abbey, envious eyes glinted. Thomas Cromwell, the king's cunning minister, watched with a calculating smile, already weaving the threads of her downfall. Anne's reign was a whirlwind of ambition and peril. She was not content to be a silent consort. Her voice, sharp and persuasive, shaped royal policy, championed Protestant scholars, and challenged the old order. She adorned herself with jewels that rivaled the stars, her laughter echoing through the halls of Whitehall Palace. But her failure to produce a male heir gnawed at Henry's patience. The birth of Elizabeth in September 1533, though celebrated, was a bitter disappointment to a king obsessed with dynasty. Whispers grew louder. Anne was too bold, too powerful, too dangerous. Courtiers who once kissed her hand now traded rumors of her flirtations, her sharp tongue, her alleged witchcraft. The court, a nest of vipers, turned against her. By 1536, Henry's ardor had cooled, his gaze fixed on Jane Seymour, a demure lady-in-waiting whose meekness promised the son Anne could not deliver. The turning point came in April 1536, when Anne's world unraveled with terrifying speed. A miscarriage in January had sealed her fate in Henry's eyes. The court buzzed with gossip, and Cromwell, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. He crafted a web of lies so audacious they would shatter any modern court. Anne, he claimed, had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, and plotted to murder the king. These accusations, as flimsy as cobwebs, were backed by coerced confessions and fabricated evidence. On May 2nd in 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace, her laughter silenced as guards seized her. The same corridors where she had danced as queen now led to a barge that carried her to the Tower of London. The crowd along the Thames watched in eerie silence, some whispering that the river itself seemed to darken as she passed. The tower, once a symbol of her triumph, became her cage, its damp stone walls etched with the despair of countless prisoners closed in around her. Anne's chambers, though furnished for a queen, mocked her former glory. The tapestries were faded, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and fear. For 19 days, she lived in a purgatory of uncertainty. Cromwell's interrogations were relentless, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he pressed her to confess to crimes she could scarcely comprehend. "Confess, madam, and spare your soul," he urged. But Anne's defiance held firm. She knelt in prayer each night, her whispered pleas echoing in the darkness, begging for strength, for her daughter's future, for a miracle that never came. One night a scream tore through her chambers as she awoke from a nightmare. Certain the sword had already fallen, her ladies-in-waiting, trembling with their own fear, could only watch as their queen unraveled. The delays were no accident. Henry, a master of cruelty, orchestrated each postponement to prolong her torment. The execution, originally set for early May, was rescheduled multiple times, each change a twist of the knife. Rumors swirled through London's taverns. The queen was a witch, a traitor, a harlot. Crowds gathered outside the tower, some cursing her name, others whispering of her innocence. Anne, isolated from all but her loyal ladies, heard these rumors through the stone walls, each word a lash against her spirit. Yet even in her despair, she clung to her wit. "They will call me Anne sans tête," she joked one evening, her laughter brittle as glass. Her ladies forced smiles, but their eyes betrayed their horror. Modern scholars might call this dissociation, a desperate shield against unimaginable trauma. But to Anne, it was survival. Cromwell's campaign was not just against Anne's body, but her very existence. Portraits of her were burned, her royal emblems chiseled from palace walls. Her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3, was declared illegitimate, her household dissolved, her tiny gowns packed away. The court moved on as if Anne had never existed. Jane Seymour, pale and docile, was already being fitted for a wedding gown, her presence a silent rebuke to Anne's fire. Henry, ensconced at Whitehall, planned his future with chilling indifference, his love for Anne reduced to ash. Yet in the Tower, Anne's spirit flickered. She wrote letters that were never delivered, their words lost to history, and spent hours gazing at the sliver of sky visible through her window, as if seeking a sign of salvation. The city of London, too, felt the weight of her impending doom. Church bells tolled at odd hours, as if mourning in advance. A strange unease gripped the streets, with some claiming to see omens, a raven circling the tower, a sudden storm darkening the Thames. These whispers, perhaps exaggerated by time, spoke to the collective dread of a kingdom about to witness a queen's execution. Anne, once the spark that ignited a revolution, was now a scapegoat for a king's ambition and a court's betrayal. Her enemies, led by Cromwell, ensured that every accusation stuck, their lies woven so tightly that even the skeptical began to waver. The trial, a farce held in the Tower's Great Hall, was over before it began. Anne's defense, eloquent and fierce, fell on deaf ears. The verdict was inevitable: death. As the day of execution approached, Anne's resolve hardened. She refused to confess, knowing her words would be twisted to condemn her further. Instead, she prepared for her final act, choosing a simple gray gown, a stark contrast to the opulence of her coronation. Her ladies wept as they dressed her, their hands trembling as they pinned her hair. Anne, sensing their fear, offered a faint smile. "Do not weep for me," she said, her voice steady but hollow. "I go to a better place." Yet in the quiet of her chamber, she knelt before a makeshift altar, her prayers feverish, her heart pounding with the knowledge that no mercy would come. The tower's walls seemed to close tighter, the air thick with the weight of her fate. Outside, London buzzed with anticipation. The execution was no secret, it was a spectacle, a warning to any who dared defy the king. Handbills circulated, proclaiming Anne's crimes, while royal agents ensured the crowd would jeer. The stage was set, not just for a death, but for a performance that would echo through history. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed England, was to be unmade, her legacy buried in an unmarked grave. But as the sun rose on May 19, 1536, a question lingered in the air, unspoken yet palpable. Could even the sharpest blade silence a spirit that burned so brightly? The answer would unfold in the shadow of the scaffold, where Anne's final moments would defy the king's cruel design. Chapter 2: The Prison of the Mind. The iron door of Anne Boleyn's chamber in the Tower of London groaned shut, sealing her in a world of shadows and dread. It was May the year 1536, and the queen who once dazzled England with her wit and fire now stood alone, her heart pounding like a war drum. The air was thick with the damp chill of stone, the faint stench of decay seeping from the walls. For 19 days, this fortress, once her stage for triumph, would become her crucible, where every whisper, every delay, and every lie would carve deeper into her soul. Anne's execution loomed, but the true torture was not the blade yet to fall. It was the relentless assault on her mind, a calculated dance of cruelty orchestrated by Henry VIII and his cunning minister, Thomas Cromwell. In this prison of the mind, Anne would face her darkest fears, her spirit teetering between defiance and despair. The Queen's lodgings, where Anne was confined, were a cruel mockery of her former glory. The tapestries hung limp, their colors dulled by time, and the narrow window offered only a sliver of gray sky. Her bed, draped in threadbare velvet, creaked under her restless weight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant clank of guards' boots or the occasional wail of another prisoner. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, assigned to serve her, were also her jailers, their eyes darting nervously, forbidden to offer comfort. They watched as she paced, her once graceful steps now frantic, her fingers twisting the pearl ring Henry had given her years ago, a bitter relic of a love turned to ash. Outside, London churned with rumors. The Queen was a traitor, a witch, a whore. These words, though unheard, seemed to seep through the stones, wrapping around Anne like a noose. Cromwell's interrogations were the sharpest weapon in this psychological siege. He swept into her chamber unannounced, his black robes blending with the shadows, his voice a low, oily hum that masked his venom. "Madam, confess your sins, and the king may yet show mercy," he urged, his quill scratching lies onto parchment. Anne, her eyes blazing despite her exhaustion, refused to bend. "I have no sins to confess, save loving a king too well," she retorted, her voice steady but edged with fear. Cromwell's smile was a blade, his questions relentless. Who were her lovers? When did she plot the king's death? Each accusation was more grotesque than the last. Adultery with her brother George, incest, conspiracy to poison Henry. Anne's laughter, sharp and hollow, echoed in the room. "You weave tales fit for tavern gossip, not a court of law," she said. But her bravado masked a growing terror. The lies were so brazen they seemed unstoppable, a tide that would drown her. Sleep was Anne's greatest enemy. Each night, she knelt by her bed, praying until her knees ached, her lips murmuring psalms in a desperate bid for peace. But peace eluded her. Nightmares clawed at her mind. Visions of a faceless swordsman, a scaffold slick with blood, or Elizabeth, her daughter, weeping alone in a darkened hall. One night a distant church bell tolled at an odd hour, its mournful clang piercing the silence. Anne bolted upright, her scream tearing through the chamber. "It is time!" she cried, her hands clutching her throat as if the blade had already struck. Her ladies rushed to her, their whispers barely calming her racing heart. The bell, they assured her, was no signal of death, but to Anne every sound was an omen, every shadow a threat. Modern minds might call this torment a deliberate form of psychological torture, disorientation, isolation, the weaponization of uncertainty. But to Anne, it was a living hell. The delays in her execution were Henry's cruelest stroke. The date, first set for early May, shifted without explanation, each postponement a fresh wound. Anne's ladies whispered of the king's orders, of a swordsman summoned from Calais, his arrival delayed by storms across the channel. "Why does he toy with me?" Anne asked one evening, her voice breaking. No answer came, only the weight of silence. Henry, ensconced at Whitehall with Jane Seymour, reveled in this power, each day of Anne's suffering a testament to his absolute control. The court had already erased her, her portraits burned, her emblems defaced, her name forbidden. To the world, Anne Boleyn was already a ghost, her execution a mere formality. Yet within the tower, she clung to life, her spirit a flickering flame in the darkness. Anne's wit, her sharpest weapon, became her shield. One afternoon, as her ladies embroidered in tense silence, she laughed, a brittle, defiant sound. "They will call me Anne sans tête, queen without a head," she jested, her eyes glinting with gallows humor. The ladies forced smiles, but one, unable to bear the strain, fled the room in tears. Anne's jests were a mask, a desperate attempt to hold her fracturing mind together. She spent hours writing letters, pleas to Henry, prayers for Elizabeth, only to see them confiscated by guards. "They fear my words more than my life," she murmured, her voice heavy with realization. These letters, lost to history, were her final rebellion, a refusal to be silenced even as the noose tightened. The tower itself seemed to conspire against her. Its walls, etched with the despair of past prisoners, whispered of death. At night, the Thames lapped against the fortress, its rhythm like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. Anne, staring through her window, saw ravens circling the White Tower, their cries sharp in the dawn mist. Superstition gripped her. A raven was an ill omen, a harbinger of doom. "They come for me," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Her ladies, fearful of her growing agitation, tried to distract her with prayer, but Anne's thoughts spiraled. She spoke of Elizabeth, her voice softening. "Will she know her mother's truth, or only their lies?" she asked, her eyes distant. The question hung unanswered, a wound that bled quietly. Cromwell's lies extended beyond Anne's chamber. 5 men, including her brother George, were arrested, their trials a prelude to her own. Their coerced confessions, extracted through torture, sealed Anne's fate before she could speak. George's laughter, so like her own, haunted her dreams. "He is innocent, as am I," she told her ladies, her voice fierce but trembling. The trials, held in the tower's great hall, were a farce, the verdict written before the first witness spoke. Anne, barred from attending, heard the news through her jailers. All 5 were condemned to die. The weight of their deaths crushed her, each one a brick in the wall of her despair. "They kill them to silence me," she said, her hands shaking as she clutched her prayer book. As the days dragged on, Anne's body betrayed her. She ate little, her once radiant face gaunt, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Yet her spirit refused to break entirely. She dressed each morning with care, as if defying the tower's gloom. "I am still a queen," she told her ladies, pinning her hair with trembling fingers. Her prayers grew fervent, her voice rising in the darkness, a plea to a god who seemed deaf. One night, a guard, moved by her anguish, slipped her a scrap of bread blessed by a priest, a small act of kindness that brought tears to her eyes. "There is yet some mercy in this world," she whispered, clutching the bread like a talisman. Outside, London pulsed with a feverish anticipation. Handbills proclaiming Anne's crimes littered the streets, their ink smearing in the rain. Crowds gathered at the tower's gates, some cursing her, others whispering of her innocence. A strange storm swept the city on May 18th, its thunder rattling the tower's walls. Anne, startled awake, saw lightning illuminate her chamber, casting her shadow long and jagged. "It is a sign," she murmured, though whether of salvation or doom, she could not say. The storm passed, but the unease lingered, a prelude to the horror awaiting her. As the 19th day dawned, Anne sensed the end was near. The guards' footsteps grew heavier, their voices hushed. Her ladies, pale and trembling, whispered of the swordsman's arrival, his blade honed to a razor's edge. Anne knelt one final time, her prayer book open to a psalm of deliverance. "Into thy hands, O Lord," she whispered, her voice steady but laced with fear. The tower's bell tolled, its clang a hammer against her heart. She rose, her gray gown clinging to her frame, and faced the door. The prison of her mind had forged her anew, not broken, but sharpened, ready to meet her fate with the fire that had defined her life. The scaffold awaited, but Anne Boleyn would walk to it as a queen, her spirit unbowed, her legacy a flame that no blade could extinguish. Chapter 3. The Arena of Death. The dawn of May 19, 1536, broke over London with a treacherous brilliance, the sky a cruel canvas of gold and blue that mocked the darkness about to unfold. Tower Green, nestled within the ancient walls of the Tower of London, was no longer a quiet lawn, but a pulsing arena, transformed into a Tudor spectacle of death. The air thrummed with the roar of a crowd. Hundreds of Londoners, nobles, and royal agents packed shoulder to shoulder, their voices a cacophony of jeers and curses. An effigy of Anne Boleyn, crudely stitched and smeared with red paint, was hoisted above the throng, pelted with stones and rotten fruit. This was no solemn execution. It was a carnival of cruelty, a public theater designed to crush a queen and cement Henry VIII's iron rule. As Anne prepared in her chamber for her final walk, the stage was set for a tragedy that would sear itself into history. The scaffold, a low wooden platform barely 3 feet high, stood at the heart of Tower Green, its planks stained dark from the blood of countless traitors. Unlike the towering scaffolds of legend, this one was deliberately humble, robbing Anne of any regal elevation, forcing her to face the jeering mob at their level. The executioner, a shadowy figure summoned from Calais, stood motionless beside it, his black cloak billowing in the morning breeze. Whispers called him the Shadow of Death, a master swordsman whose blade could sever a neck with a single, merciless stroke. His face was hidden beneath a hood, his eyes glinting like steel, and the sword at his side, a French weapon, razor sharp and weighted for precision, gleamed with a cold promise. His presence was a chilling enigma, a stranger tasked with ending a queen's life, his fee paid in gold by a king already planning his next wedding. Inside the queen's lodgings, Anne Boleyn dressed for death with the care of a woman who refused to be broken. Her hands, once adorned with jewels, now trembled as she fastened a simple gray gown, its somber hue a stark contrast to the crimson of her coronation. Her ladies in waiting, their faces pale and streaked with tears, pinned her dark hair beneath a coif, their whispers barely audible over the distant roar of the crowd. Anne's eyes, hollow from sleepless nights, burned with a fierce resolve. "I will meet my fate as a queen," she told them, her voice steady but laced with a tremor only those closest could detect. She clutched her prayer book, its pages worn from endless nights of supplication, and murmured a final psalm. The air in the chamber was heavy, the scent of wax from flickering candles mingling with the damp chill of stone. A sudden gust rattled the window, and Anne flinched, her gaze darting to the sliver of sky. "Is it a sign?" she whispered, but no answer came. Outside, the crowd's frenzy grew, fueled by royal propagandists who had spent weeks poisoning the city's heart against its queen. Handbills littered the streets, proclaiming Anne's crimes: adultery, incest, treason, each word a lash designed to strip her of dignity. Men in the king's livery moved through the throng, shouting accusations, urging the mob to cheer her death. "The witch will burn in hell," one cried, and the crowd echoed, their voices a wall of sound that shook the tower's ancient stones. Yet not all were swayed. In the shadows, a few faces, merchants, maids, even a priest, watched with tight lips, their eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. One woman, clutching a rosary, whispered a prayer for Anne's soul, only to be silenced by a guard's glare. The king's will was absolute, and dissent was a death sentence. The preparations for the execution were meticulous, every detail a testament to Henry's theatrical cruelty. The scaffold was ringed by a double line of guards, their pikes gleaming, not to prevent escape, but to ensure no one dared disrupt the spectacle. Church bells across London were poised to toll at the moment of death, a citywide signal of royal justice. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning, not dawn, to maximize attendance, transforming Anne's private agony into public entertainment. Tower Green could hold only a select audience, nobles, officials, and favored courtiers, but the tower's walls amplified the crowd's roar, ensuring Anne would hear their hatred as she approached. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, ale, and the faint metallic tang of blood from prior executions, a grim reminder of the scaffold's history. Anne's final moments in her chamber were a battle between fear and defiance. She knelt before a small crucifix, her lips moving in fervent prayer, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "O Lord, deliver me from this evil," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her ladies, unable to bear her anguish, wept openly, one collapsing to her knees. Anne rose, her face composed but her eyes haunted. She turned to her ladies, offering a faint smile. "Do not fear for me," she said, though her voice wavered. "I go to God." As the door creaked open, revealing the lieutenant of the tower, her breath caught. "It is time, madam," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Anne nodded, her chin lifting, and stepped into the corridor, flanked by guards whose faces were stone. The same halls where she had walked as a crowned queen now led to her doom, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The walk to Tower Green was a descent into nightmare. The corridor's torchlight cast jagged shadows, and the roar of the crowd grew louder, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to drown her. Anne's gown brushed the cold stone floor, her prayer book clutched like a shield. Guards pressed close, their armor clinking, their eyes avoiding hers. As she emerged into the open air, the crowd's fury hit her like a physical blow. "Harlot! Traitor!" they screamed, their faces twisted with hate. Stones skittered across the grass, one narrowly missing her. Anne's step faltered, but she straightened, her gaze fixed on the scaffold ahead. A sudden gust swept through the green, chilling her skin and stirring the effigy's tattered cloth. To some it was a natural breeze, to others a whisper from the grave, a sign that the heavens watched. The swordsman awaited her, his stillness unnerving. His blade, propped against the scaffold, caught the sun, its edge a line of fire. Anne's eyes darted to it, her breath quickening. She had heard of the Calais executioner's skill, his ability to kill with a single stroke, but the sight of him, a faceless specter, sent a shiver through her. Unlike the clumsy English axe, which often required multiple blows, this sword promised precision, but its foreignness was a final indignity, a reminder that even her death was a performance imported for spectacle. The crowd hushed as she approached the scaffold, their anticipation a palpable weight. A nobleman in the front row, once her ally, turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Another, a young poet named Wyatt, watched with anguished eyes, his hands clenched as if to hold back a cry. Anne mounted the scaffold's few steps, her movements deliberate, her head held high. The platform creaked beneath her, the wood rough under her thin slippers. The crowd's roar surged, but she stood unmoved, a solitary figure against a sea of hate. The swordsman stepped forward, his cloak rustling, and bowed, a hollow gesture of respect that mocked her fate. Anne's lips parted, as if to speak, but she paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. Somewhere in that throng were Henry's spies, waiting to twist her words. She clutched her prayer book tighter, its pages a silent witness to her truth. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, as all eyes fixed on the queen who had defied a king and now faced the blade. The air grew heavy, the sun dimming as a cloud passed overhead. A raven perched on the tower's ramparts let out a harsh cry, its wings black against the sky. The crowd stirred, some crossing themselves, others whispering of omens. Anne's gaze lifted, her face pale but resolute. She knew her next words would be her last act, a chance to shape her legacy before the sword fell. The scaffold was her final stage, and she would play her part with the fire that had defined her life. As she opened her mouth to speak, the world held its breath, waiting for the voice of a queen about to be silenced forever. Chapter 4. The Queen's Final Words. The scaffold creaked beneath Anne Boleyn's feet, a fragile stage set against the seething tide of Tower Green's crowd. On May 19, 1536, the sun hung high, its golden rays a cruel mockery of the death about to unfold. The mob, a writhing beast of jeers and curses, surged against the line of pikemen guarding the platform. Their voices roared like a storm, hurling venom at the queen who had dared to rise too high. Anne stood alone, her gray gown clinging to her slender frame, her prayer book clutched like a talisman. The swordsman from Calais, a hooded specter known as the Shadow of Death, waited silently, his blade gleaming with a cold promise. As Anne lifted her gaze to the crowd, her heart thundered. Yet her face was a mask of regal composure. This was her final act, her last chance to speak before the sword silenced her forever. In these fleeting moments, Anne Boleyn would defy her enemies with words that would echo through the ages. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and blood, the scaffold's planks etched with the ghosts of past executions. The crowd's hatred was a living thing, their shouts, "Witch! Traitor!" punctuated by the thud of stones against the effigy of Anne, now tattered and blood-smeared. Yet pockets of silence rippled through the throng. A merchant's wife clutched her child, her eyes wet with pity. A young poet, Thomas Wyatt, stood rigid among the nobles, his face pale, his hands trembling as he fought the urge to cry out. Even some guards, their faces schooled to stone, shifted uneasily, their loyalty to Henry VIII warring with the sight of a queen facing death with such grace. Anne's eyes swept over them, searching for a flicker of humanity, but found mostly cold indifference. She knew Henry's spies were among them, their quills poised to twist her words into further damnation. The swordsman stepped forward, his cloak rustling, and bowed, a hollow gesture that stung like a slap. Anne's breath caught, her gaze darting to his sword, its edge a line of fire in the sunlight. She had heard whispers of his skill, how he could sever a neck with one stroke, unlike the clumsy English axe that often mangled its victims. Yet his faceless presence was a final indignity, a stranger imported to kill a queen for the spectacle of it. The crowd hushed, their anticipation a palpable weight, as if the air itself held its breath. Anne's fingers tightened on her prayer book, its leather worn from nights of desperate prayer. She stood straighter, her chin lifting, refusing to let the mob see her fear. The scaffold was her stage, and she would play her part with the fire that had defined her life. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear but trembling at the edges, slicing through the crowd's murmur. The words carried a quiet power, forcing even the most vicious to pause. "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Her tone was measured, each syllable a careful step on a knife's edge. She acknowledged the law, Henry's law, but stopped short of admitting guilt, a subtle defiance that rippled through the crowd. A nobleman in velvet scowled, his quill scratching furiously, while a woman in the back gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Anne's eyes, dark and unyielding, moved across the faces before her, as if memorizing their judgment. "I pray God save the king," she continued, her voice softening, "and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." The words were a masterstroke, a bitter irony cloaked in humility. To praise Henry, the man who had orchestrated her destruction, was to expose his cruelty without a single accusation. The crowd stirred, some nodding in approval, others muttering in confusion. Wyatt's eyes glistened, his jaw clenched, knowing the cost of her words. Anne's voice wavered as she spoke of mercy, her thoughts flashing to Elizabeth, her daughter, left defenseless in a court that had devoured her mother. "If any person will meddle with my cause," she said, her voice rising, "I require them to judge the best." It was a plea, not for herself, but for history, for those who might one day seek her truth. The crowd's reaction was a fractured mirror. Some jeered, others fell silent, a few wept. A guard shifted, his pike clanging against another, the sound jarring in the tense air. Anne's gaze dropped to the scaffold, her breath quickening. She knew her words would be reported to Henry, dissected for treason, yet she had spoken them anyway. Her heart ached for Elizabeth, barely 3, already branded illegitimate, her future hanging by a thread. The thought of her daughter's tiny face, alone in a world of enemies, nearly broke her resolve. But Anne steeled herself, her lips pressing into a thin line. She would not give the crowd her tears, nor Henry her surrender. The swordsman gestured, indicating it was time. Anne's stomach lurched, her knees threatening to buckle, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I am ready," she said, her voice barely audible, meant for herself as much as for him. She handed her prayer book to one of her ladies, Margaret Wyatt, whose hand shook as she took it, tears streaming down her face. "Keep this for my daughter," Anne whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Margaret nodded, choking back a sob, as the other ladies clung to each other, their grief a silent scream. Anne removed her coif, letting her dark hair spill free, a cascade of defiance against the gray of her gown. The crowd gasped, some seeing not a traitor but a queen, radiant even in her final moments. The executioner knelt, asking forgiveness, a tradition that felt like mockery. "I forgive you," Anne said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she adjusted her gown. He offered a blindfold and she hesitated, her eyes darting to the blade. To be spared the sight of death was a mercy, but it also meant facing the unknown. "I will trust in God," she said, accepting the cloth. As it was tied over her eyes, the world went dark, her senses sharpening. The crowd's murmur became a dull roar, the creak of the scaffold a thunder in her ears. She knelt upright as French custom demanded, her back straight, her hands clasped in prayer. "Jesu, receive my soul," she whispered, her lips moving ceaselessly, a lifeline to the divine. The swordsman's footsteps were silent, his approach a ghost's whisper. Anne's body tensed, her blindfolded eyes straining to catch any sound. The rustle of his cloak, the shift of his grip on the sword. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her prayers growing frantic. "Oh Lord, have mercy," she murmured, her voice a threat in the wind. The crowd fell silent, their bloodlust sated by the sight of a queen reduced to this, a figure of grace and terror, awaiting the blade. A raven perched on the tower's ramparts let out a piercing cry, its wings beating against the sky. Some in the crowd crossed themselves, whispering of omens, while others gripped their neighbors, unable to look away. Anne's mind raced, images flashing behind her blindfold. Her coronation, Elizabeth's birth, Henry's once adoring gaze. She thought of her brother George, executed days before, his laughter silenced forever. "We are innocent," she whispered, her voice lost to the wind. The swordsman raised his blade, its shadow falling across the scaffold, unseen by Anne, but felt in the sudden chill that gripped her. Her lips moved faster, her prayers a desperate chant, as she braced for the unknown. The crowd held its breath, the world narrowing to this single moment. The queen, the sword, the silence before the storm. The scaffold's edge seemed to tilt, as if the earth itself recoiled from what was to come. Anne's final thought was of Elizabeth, a fleeting prayer that her daughter might one day reclaim her mother's truth. The swordsman's muscles tensed, his blade poised for the strike that would end a queen and birth a legend. In that frozen instant, Anne Boleyn stood at the crossroads of history, her words a flame that no blade could extinguish, her spirit a challenge to the king who sought to erase her. Chapter 5, The Blade and the Curse. The world held its breath as the swordsman from Calais raised his blade, a silver crescent gleaming against the May sky. On the scaffold of Tower Green, May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt, blindfolded, her lips trembling with whispered prayers. The crowd, a roiling sea of jeers and gasps, fell into an eerie hush, their eyes fixed on the queen who had defied a king. Her gray gown clung to her frame, her dark hair spilling beneath the blindfold, a final act of defiance against the indignity of her fate. The air was thick with the stench of blood and sweat, the scaffold's planks groaning under the weight of history. Then a sudden crack of thunder split the sky, a sound so violent it seemed the heavens themselves recoiled. The blade fell, swift and merciless, and Anne Boleyn's head rolled, her blood painting the wood crimson. But what followed was a horror that would haunt witnesses for generations. A queen's severed head, eyes wide and lips moving, as if cursing the world that betrayed her. The moment the sword struck, time seemed to fracture. Anne's body slumped forward, a lifeless marionette, while her head tumbled into the straw, the blindfold slipping to reveal eyes that stared, unblinking, into the void. A gasp tore through the crowd, some clutching their neighbors, others turning away in terror. A young girl in the front row screamed, her voice piercing the silence, certain she saw Anne's lips form words, a prayer, a plea, or perhaps a curse. "She lives!" a man shouted, crossing himself, while others whispered of witchcraft, their fear fueled by the grotesque sight. Modern science might explain it as a fleeting neurological reflex, oxygen lingering in the brain. But to the Tudor crowd, it was a moment of supernatural dread, a sign that Anne's spirit refused to yield. The swordsman, his face hidden beneath his hood, stepped back, his work done with chilling precision. He bent to retrieve the head, lifting it by the hair as tradition demanded. blood dripping in a steady rhythm onto the scaffold. "Behold the head of a traitor," he declared, his voice a low growl that carried across Tower Green. The crowd's roar returned, a mix of triumph and horror, but many could not look, their eyes fixed on the ground or the sky, anywhere but the ghastly spectacle. A noblewoman fainted, her velvet gown crumpling as attendants rushed to her. Thomas Wyatt, the poet who had once adored Anne, stood frozen among the nobles, his face ashen, his hands clenched as if to hold back a scream. The sight of her head, once crowned with jewels, now a grisly trophy, burned into his memory, a wound that would bleed into his verses. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, stationed at the scaffold's edge, were thrust into a nightmare of their own. Margaret Wyatt, clutching the prayer book Anne had entrusted to her, wept openly, her sobs drowned by the crowd's clamor. The other ladies, their faces pale as death, moved forward with trembling hands to gather their queen's remains. But no coffin awaited her, a final, calculated insult from Henry VIII. The guards stood impassive as the women scrambled, their skirts stained with blood and straw, searching for anything to hold Anne's body. In desperation, they found an old arrow chest, its wood splintered and reeking of iron, barely large enough for her headless form. Margaret, her hands shaking, gently lifted Anne's head, wrapping it in linen as tears streamed down her face. "She was our queen," she whispered, her voice breaking as she placed the head beside the body, the chest a mockery of a royal tomb. The crowd's frenzy began to ebb, replaced by an uneasy murmur. The thunder, unnatural for a clear May day, lingered in their minds, a divine protest against the king's justice. A raven, its wings black as night, swooped low over the scaffold, its cry sharp and accusing. Some in the crowd whispered of omens, of a queen's soul unbound, ready to haunt those who had betrayed her. A guard, unnerved, muttered a prayer, his pike trembling in his grip. The swordsman, indifferent to the whispers, wiped his blade clean, its edge still gleaming as if untouched by blood. His work was done, his fee earned, but the weight of his act hung heavy in the air, a shadow that would follow him back to Calais. The disposal of Anne's remains was as swift as it was callous. The ladies carried the arrow chest to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, their steps faltering under the weight of grief and horror. The chapel, a somber sanctuary within the tower, offered no solace. No priest awaited to perform the rites. No candles were lit for Anne's soul. The women, their hands stained with her blood, laid the chest beneath the chapel floor, in a shallow, unmarked grave, among other executed nobles. The earth was cold, the silence deafening, as they shoveled dirt over their queen, their sobs the only requiem. One lady, unable to bear the indignity, slipped a small silver ring, Anne's own left behind in her chamber, into the chest, a secret act of defiance against the king's erasure. "May God keep you," she whispered, her voice lost in the darkness. Beyond the tower's walls, London stirred with a strange unease. Church bells tolled, their somber peals announcing the Queen's death to a city already awash in rumors. Some cheered, believing the handbills that branded Anne a traitor. Others whispered of injustice, their voices hushed for fear of Henry's spies. The Thames flowing past the tower seemed to carry a crimson tint, as if mourning the blood spilled on its banks. In taverns and marketplaces, tales of the execution spread, embellished with each telling. Anne's head had spoken, her eyes had cursed, her spirit had risen with the thunder. These stories, half-truths born of fear and awe, wove Anne into legend, a queen whose death defied the king's attempt to erase her. The horror of the moment rippled beyond the scaffold. Anne's ladies, forever scarred, would carry the weight of that day for years. Margaret Wyatt, clutching the prayer book, vowed to protect it for Elizabeth, though she knew the danger of such a promise. Another lady, Jane Parker, would later flee to a convent, haunted by nightmares of Anne's staring eyes. Even the guards, hardened by years of service, spoke in hushed tones of the thunder, the raven, the unnatural silence that followed the sword's strike. The execution was meant to be a clean end, a demonstration of royal power, but it left a stain that no amount of propaganda could wash away. Henry VIII, ensconced at Whitehall Palace, received the news with chilling indifference. As the bells tolled, he laughed with courtiers, his thoughts already on Jane Seymour, whose wedding was planned within days. The speed of his betrayal was a final dagger to Anne's memory, a declaration that she was nothing more than a problem solved. Yet even in his revelry, a shadow lingered. Whispers reached him of the crowd's unease, of omens that refused to fade. Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, was said to pause that night, his quill trembling as he wrote, haunted by the thought of a queen who might not rest. The execution was not just a death, but a spectacle designed to crush a woman who had risen too high. Henry's court moved on, erasing Anne's name from records, her portraits burned, her emblems chiseled away. But the arrow chest, buried in haste, held more than a body. It held a legacy that would not be silenced. The thunder that shook Tower Green, the raven's cry, the whispers of a curse, these were the sparks of Anne's defiance, kindling a fire that would burn through history. As the crowd dispersed, their footsteps heavy with unease, a question hung in the air. Could a king's blade truly extinguish a queen whose spirit burned so fiercely? Anne's final moments were a paradox, a moment of horror that birthed a myth. The scaffold, slick with her blood, stood as a testament to Tudor cruelty, but also to a woman who faced death with unyielding courage. Her head, wrapped in linen, was no longer just flesh, but a symbol of resistance, a challenge to the king who sought to erase her. As the sun sank over London, casting long shadows across the tower, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Anne's spirit to rise. The blade had fallen, but the curse of Anne Boleyn, her truth, her fire, her legacy, was only beginning to take shape. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Betrayal. The echo of the swordsman's blade still lingered in the air as the crowd dispersed from Tower Green, their footsteps heavy with unease. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn's blood stained the scaffold, her severed head wrapped in linen, her body stuffed into a splintered arrow chest. The sun, once a cruel witness to her death, now dipped low, casting long shadows over the Tower of London. But the horror of her execution did not end with the fall of the sword. It rippled outward, a poison seeping into the hearts of those who witnessed it, a wound that festered in the court of Henry VIII. As London whispered of omens and curses, the king reveled in his triumph, his heart already turned to Jane Seymour. Yet in the silence of the night, a shadow stirred, a specter of betrayal that would haunt the guilty and the innocent alike. At Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII received the news of Anne's death with a smile that chilled the air. The bells of London, tolling to mark the Queen's end, were drowned out by the clink of goblets and the laughter of courtiers. "The deed is done," a messenger announced, bowing low. Henry, resplendent in cloth of gold, raised his glass, his eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction. "To a new dawn," he toasted, his voice carrying over the banquet hall. Jane Seymour, pale and demure, sat at his side, her hands folded, her smile fragile. Within hours of Anne's execution, Henry declared their betrothal, the announcement a public erasure of the woman who had once been his obsession. The court, ever eager to please, cheered, but their eyes darted nervously, as if fearing Anne's ghost might rise to challenge them. The speed of Henry's betrayal was a dagger to Anne's memory, a calculated act to bury her in oblivion. Courtiers who had once knelt before her, now spoke her name in hushed tones, if at all. Her portraits, once adorning palace walls, were burned in secret pyres, their ashes scattered to the wind. Her royal emblems, carved in stone, were chiseled away, leaving blank scars where her legacy had been. The king's propagandists worked tirelessly, spinning tales of Anne's depravity, her alleged lovers, her supposed witchcraft, ensuring her name became a curse. Yet even in their triumph, a tremor of unease lingered. A servant whispered of a strange chill in the palace halls, a fleeting shadow that vanished when approached. "She is not gone," he murmured, crossing himself, but his words were dismissed as superstition. For Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the execution was a wound that would never heal. Margaret Wyatt, clutching the prayer book Anne had entrusted to her, returned to her quarters trembling, her hands still stained with the Queen's blood. The book, its pages worn from Anne's fervent prayers, felt heavier than stone, a sacred relic she vowed to protect for Elizabeth. But the cost was high. Margaret's dreams were haunted by the scaffold, by Anne's staring eyes, by the thud of her head in the straw. Another lady, Jane Parker, collapsed in her chamber, her screams echoing through the night as she saw Anne's severed neck in every shadow. Days later, Jane fled to a convent, her mind shattered by the horror she had witnessed. "She will haunt us all," she whispered to a nun, her eyes wild with fear. The other ladies, bound by duty, remained in the court, but their laughter was gone, their faces etched with a grief they dared not speak. The tower itself seemed to mourn. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne's body lay in its unmarked grave, was cloaked in an unnatural silence. No priest had performed the rites, no candles burned for her soul. The arrow chest, a humiliating vessel for a queen, rested beneath the cold stone floor, surrounded by the bones of other forgotten traitors. Yet whispers spread among the guards of strange occurrences, a faint tapping from the chapel at midnight, a flicker of light where no candle burned. One guard, a grizzled veteran, swore he saw a figure in gray standing by the altar, her head bowed as if in prayer. "It was her," he told his comrades, his voice shaking. "She seeks justice." The tale spread, fueling rumors that Anne's spirit lingered, a restless force bound to the tower's ancient stones. London, too, was gripped by a feverish unease. The storm that had shaken Tower Green during the execution became a legend, its thunder a divine protest against the king's cruelty. In taverns, men spoke in low voices of the raven that had circled the scaffold, its cry a harbinger of doom. Women in the marketplaces clutched their children, whispering of a queen's curse that would plague the Tudors. Handbills proclaiming Anne's guilt were trampled in the mud, replaced by hushed tales of her innocence. A priest, defying the king's edict, lit a candle for Anne in a hidden chapel, praying for her soul. "She was no traitor," he murmured, his voice trembling with defiance. These acts, small and secret, were sparks in the darkness, proof that Anne's memory could not be so easily erased. At court, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, maintained his icy composure, but cracks began to show. Late at night, alone in his chamber, he was said to pause, his quill trembling as he wrote. Servants whispered of his restless sleep, of murmurs that he saw Anne standing at his bedside, her neck dripping blood, her eyes accusing. Whether truth or rumor, the story spread, a shadow over Cromwell's triumph. His meticulous plan, false confessions, fabricated trials, a queen's execution, had succeeded, but at a cost. The court, once a place of revelry, grew tense, its corridors haunted by the fear that Anne's death had unleashed something uncontainable. Even Henry, in his moments of solitude, was said to flinch at sudden noises, as if expecting her ghost to confront him. The cruelest wound was inflicted on Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, not yet 3 years old. Declared illegitimate the moment the sword fell, She was stripped of her title, her household dissolved, her tiny gowns packed away. The court turned its back on her, as if her mother's shame tainted her blood. A nursemaid, loyal to Anne, hid a lock of Elizabeth's red hair, a secret keepsake from a queen now reviled. "She is her mother's daughter," the nursemaid whispered, risking her life to preserve Anne's legacy. Elizabeth, unaware of the storm around her, played in a crumbling manner, her laughter a faint echo of Anne's. Yet the seeds of her future greatness, her mother's wit, her fire, were already taking root, a silent promise that Anne's spirit would endure. The execution's aftermath was a masterclass in erasure, but it failed to silence Anne completely. Her death, meant to be a clean end, became a festering wound. The arrow chest, the unmarked grave, the burned portraits, all were meant to obliterate her, but they only deepened her myth. In the weeks that followed, stories of Anne's final moments grew, twisted by fear and awe. A seamstress claimed to have found a blood-stained ribbon in the tower, its pattern matching Anne's gown, and hid it as a relic. A poet, inspired by Wyatt's grief, penned verses of a queen whose spirit defied the grave. These fragments, whispered in secret, were the first threads of Anne's resurrection, a legacy that Henry's propaganda could not destroy. As Henry prepared to wed Jane Seymour, the court moved on, its surface polished but its heart uneasy. The king's laughter rang hollow, his eyes scanning the shadows as if sensing an unseen presence. The banquet halls of Whitehall echoed with forced merriment, but the air was thick with unspoken fears. Anne's execution had been a triumph of power, but it had also sown seeds of doubt. The thunder, the raven, the tales of a restless spirit, these were not just superstitions, but warnings. Anne Boleyn, though buried in an unmarked grave, was not gone. Her shadow lingered, a specter of betrayal that would haunt the Tudors, a reminder that even a king's blade could not sever a queen's truth. The night of May 19th, as London slept under a starless sky, a single candle burned in a hidden chamber, lit by a loyal hand for a queen denied her rights. Its flame flickered, casting shadows that danced like a woman in gray, her head held high. Anne Boleyn's story was not over. It was only beginning, a curse woven into the fabric of history, a fire that would burn brighter with each passing year. Chapter 7. The Immortal Legacy. The dust of May 19, 1536 settled over the Tower of London, but the echo of Anne Boleyn's execution reverberated far beyond its blood-stained scaffold. Her body, hastily buried in an arrow chest beneath the coal stones of St. Peter at Vincula, was meant to vanish, her name erased from history by a king's wrath. Yet as the sun sank below the horizon, casting a crimson glow over the Thames, Anne's spirit seemed to linger, a restless force woven into the fabric of England. Her death was not an end, but a spark, igniting a legacy that would defy Henry VIII's cruel design. Through her daughter Elizabeth, the whispers of a wronged queen, and the enduring power of her story, Anne Boleyn rose from an unmarked grave to become an immortal symbol of resistance, a testament to the fragility of truth and the strength of a woman who burned too brightly to be forgotten. In the immediate aftermath, Henry VIII moved with ruthless efficiency to obliterate Anne's existence. At Whitehall Palace, the revelry continued, the clink of goblets a stark contrast to the silence of the chapel where Anne lay. On May 20th, Henry announced his formal betrothal to Jane Seymour, and within 11 days they were wed in a quiet ceremony, as if Anne's 3 years as queen had been a fleeting dream. Courtiers, ever eager to curry favor, struck her name from conversation, her initials scrubbed from palace records. The king's propagandists flooded London with handbills, painting Anne as a scheming adulteress, her execution a righteous act of royal justice. Yet beneath this veneer of triumph, a shadow lingered. A courtier passing a darkened corridor swore he heard a woman sigh, though no one was there. A scribe tasked with destroying Anne's letters hesitated, his hand trembling as if her words carried a curse. The cruelest blow fell on Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, not yet 3 years old. Declared illegitimate, she was banished from court, her household dissolved, her tiny velvet gowns packed away in dusty trunks. In a crumbling manor far from London, Elizabeth played under the watchful eye of a nursemaid, unaware that her mother's blood had stained the scaffold. The nursemaid, a silent loyalist, kept a lock of Anne's hair hidden in a locket, whispering to the child of a mother who loved her fiercely. "You are her fire," she told Elizabeth, her voice a secret defiance against the king's edict. The court treated Elizabeth as a pariah, her name a reminder of a queen they were ordered to forget, yet in her bright eyes and quick wit, Anne's spirit flickered, a seed of greatness that would one day bloom into England's most celebrated queen. The ripple effects of Anne's execution reached far beyond the court. Her ladies-in-waiting, scarred by the horror of Tower Green, carried their trauma like a weight. Margaret Wyatt, clutching Anne's prayer book, vowed to pass it to Elizabeth, though the act could cost her life. She hid it in a locked chest, its pages a silent testament to a queen's faith. Jane Parker, driven to madness by nightmares of Anne's staring eyes, took her vows in a remote convent, her prayers filled with pleas for forgiveness. "She watches us," Jane whispered to the nuns, her voice trembling with fear. Even the guards of the tower, hardened by years of bloodshed, spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences. A candle flickering in the chapel without wind, a soft tapping beneath the floor where Anne was buried. These tales, dismissed as superstition, fueled a growing legend. Anne Boleyn was not gone, her spirit a restless force seeking justice. London itself seemed to mourn. The storm that had shaken Tower Green during the execution became a touchstone for storytellers. In taverns, men spoke of the raven that circled the scaffold, its cry a herald of divine wrath. Women in the markets whispered of a queen's curse, a shadow that would haunt the Tudors. A seamstress, rummaging through a pile of discarded cloth, found a ribbon stained with what she swore was Anne's blood, its delicate embroidery a relic of a lost queen. She hid it in her home, a secret shrine to a woman she believed innocent. These fragments, locks of hair, hidden books, whispered tales, were the threads of Anne's resurrection, defying Henry's campaign to erase her. A poet, inspired by Thomas Wyatt's grief, penned verses of a queen whose spirit soared above her grave, her voice a flame that could not be doused. The court, too, was not immune to the shadow of Anne's death. Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind of her downfall, maintained his icy control, but whispers followed him. Servants claimed he woke at night, his face pale, muttering of a figure in gray standing at his bedside, her neck dripping blood. Whether truth or rumor, the story spread, a crack in Cromwell's armor. Even Henry, in his moments of solitude, was said to flinch at sudden noises, his laughter hollow as he glanced over his shoulder. The court's revelry masked a growing unease, a fear that Anne's execution had unleashed something beyond their control. The bells that told her death seemed to ring with a warning, their peals echoing through a city that could not forget. Centuries later, Anne's story would be reclaimed, her truth pieced together from the fragments Henry sought to destroy. Historians, sifting through dusty archives, found traces of her. A letter hidden in a noble's chest, a portrait spared from the flames. In the 19th century, a scholar exploring the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula uncovered a scrap of parchment, its ink faded but legible, bearing words in Anne's hand. "Let my truth endure." Whether authentic or myth, it became a rallying cry for those who sought to restore her name. Anne, once vilified as a traitor, emerged as a symbol of resistance, a woman who challenged a king and paid the ultimate price. Her execution, meant to silence her, instead amplified her voice, her story a mirror reflecting the dangers of absolute power. Elizabeth, the daughter left in the shadows, became Anne's greatest legacy. Rising from obscurity to become Elizabeth II, England's Gloriana, she carried her mother's fire in her sharp mind and unyielding will. Her reign, a golden age, was a silent triumph for Anne, proof that the king's blade could not sever her influence. Elizabeth never spoke her mother's name publicly, but in private moments, she was said to touch a ring containing a lock of Anne's hair, a quiet tribute to the woman who shaped her. The prayer book, preserved by Margaret Wyatt's courage, found its way to Elizabeth, its pages a bridge between mother and daughter across the chasm of death. Anne's execution was a case study in the fragility of truth, a lesson that resonates in our own era of information manipulation. The charges against her, adultery, incest, treason, were lies woven by a regime to justify a king's whims, a precursor to modern campaigns of character assassination. Her story warns of the power of propaganda, the ease with which truth can be twisted by those who control the narrative. Yet it also speaks of resilience, of a woman whose voice endured despite every effort to silence it. Anne's death, orchestrated as a public spectacle, became her most enduring act of defiance, a challenge to the systems that sought to crush her. As the centuries passed, the Tower of London became a shrine to Anne's memory. Visitors to St. Peter at Vincula reported strange sensations, a chill in the air, a whisper in the silence. Tour guides spoke of a ghostly figure in gray, seen at dusk, her head bowed in prayer. Whether myth or truth, these tales kept Anne alive, her story woven into the stones of the fortress that held her. Her execution, meant to erase her, instead immortalized her, a paradox that defines her legacy. She was not just a queen, but a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to be broken, a flame that burned through the ages. In the quiet of a starless night, a single candle flickered in a hidden chamber, lit by an unknown hand for a queen denied her rights. Its light cast shadows that danced like a woman in gray, her eyes fierce, her voice a whisper that echoed through time. Anne Boleyn's legacy was not in her death, but in her defiance, a truth that no blade could sever, a fire that no king could extinguish. As the bells of London tolled, they seemed to carry her final words, "I am not gone." And in the heart of her daughter, in the stories of the faithful, in the pages of history, she never would be. Personal reflection and lessons from Anne Boleyn's story. Personal reflection. The story of Anne Boleyn, as depicted in this vivid and haunting narrative, is a gripping tapestry of ambition, betrayal, and resilience that leaves an indelible mark. Reading through her journey, from the dazzling heights of her coronation to the chilling depths of her execution, I am struck by the raw humanity of her experience. Anne emerges not just as a historical figure, but as a woman of extraordinary fire, navigating a world that both elevated and destroyed her. Her wit, her defiance, and her unyielding spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty resonate deeply, evoking both admiration and sorrow. The narrative's portrayal of her final moments, her steady voice on the scaffold, her eyes staring defiantly even in death, paints a portrait of a woman who refused to be erased, even as the world conspired to silence her. What moves me most is Anne's complexity. She was neither saint nor villain, but a woman who dared to wield power in a world that punished her for it. Her story feels like a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting the fragility of truth in the cost of ambition. The image of her blood staining the scaffold, coupled with the whispers of her curse and the enduring legacy through Elizabeth, lingers as a testament to the power of an individual spirit against overwhelming odds. In a modern context, Anne's story feels eerily relevant, a reminder of how quickly narratives can be manipulated, how power can corrupt, and how resilience can outlast even the sharpest blade. Lessons for the modern world. Anne Boleyn's story, though rooted in the Tudor era, offers profound lessons for people navigating the complexities of the 21st century. Here are key takeaways that resonate with our contemporary world. The fragility of truth in the face of power. Anne's downfall was orchestrated through a web of lies, false accusations of adultery, incest, and treason, spun by Thomas Cromwell and backed by Henry VIII's authority. This serves as a stark reminder of how truth can be distorted by those who control the narrative. In today's world of misinformation, social media echo chambers, and polarized media, we see similar dynamics. Powerful entities can shape public perception to serve their agendas. The lesson is to approach information critically, seek primary sources, and question narratives crafted by those in power, whether they be governments, corporations, or influencers. The cost of defying systems. Anne's ambition and refusal to be a silent consort made her a target. Her boldness challenged the patriarchal and religious structures of her time, leading to her destruction. This resonates in modern contexts where individuals who challenge systemic norms, whether in workplaces, politics, or social movements, often face backlash. The lesson is to recognize the risks of standing out, but also to value the courage it takes to push for change, knowing that progress often comes at a personal cost. Resilience in the face of injustice. Anne's defiance, even in her darkest moments, her sharp wit, her refusal to confess to false charges, her poised final words, shows a resilience that speaks to the human spirit's capacity to endure. In our world, where individuals face injustices like discrimination, cancel culture, or systemic oppression, Anne's story teaches us to hold fast to our truth and dignity, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Her legacy through Elizabeth proves that resilience can plant seeds for future triumph. The power of legacy over erasure. Henry VIII's attempts to erase Anne, burning her portraits, chiseling her emblems, declaring Elizabeth illegitimate, failed because her story endured through whispers, relics, and her daughter's reign. This underscores the power of legacy in the face of attempts to silence or marginalize. In today's digital age where voices can be amplified or suppressed, we learn that documenting our stories through writing, art, or advocacy can ensure they outlive attempts at erasure, inspiring future generations. The danger of absolute power. Henry's unchecked authority allowed him to orchestrate Anne's execution and reshape history to his whims. This serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, whether in politics, institutions, or personal relationships. In 2025, as we navigate authoritarian tendencies, corporate monopolies, or toxic leadership, Anne's story reminds us to advocate for checks and balances and to resist systems that prioritize power over justice. The enduring strength of women's voices. Anne's story is a testament to the strength of women who refuse to be defined by others' narratives. Her influence on England's religious reform and her daughter's reign as Elizabeth II show that a woman's voice can shape history, even when silenced. In a world where gender equality remains a struggle, Anne's legacy encourages women to speak out, claim their space, and recognize their impact, knowing that their contributions can ripple through time. The importance of empathy in judgment. The crowd's mixed reactions to Anne's execution, some jeering, others weeping, highlight the complexity of human judgment. In our polarized world, where snap judgments and online pile-ons are common, Anne's story urges us to pause and consider the humanity of those we judge. Empathy can reveal the nuances of a person's story, challenging us to look beyond propaganda or public opinion. Anne Boleyn's life and death, as depicted in this narrative, are more than a historical tragedy. They are a call to action for the modern world. Her story challenges us to question power, fight for truth, and cultivate resilience, reminding us that even in the face of betrayal and erasure, a single voice can echo through the ages, inspiring us to live with courage and purpose. Thank you so much for joining us on this gripping journey through Anne Boleyn's story on Tortures and Secrets. Your support means the world to us as we uncover the hidden truths and haunting tales of history. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated with our latest content. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Together, let's keep exploring the shadows of the past. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.